My name is Andrea Corcoran. I'm the chair of the Stratford Board of Education, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's town hall session. I know it's a busy time of year, and I really appreciate you carving out the time to be with us tonight. The Board of Education's budget work began months ago, initially as a collaboration between the superintendent, his cabinet members, building administrators, and others. Once presented to the Board of Ed Finance Subcommittee, a series of budget workshops were held. At these meetings, every aspect of the proposed budget was detailed and scrutinized. A proposed increase of 4.57%, a maintenance budget really, was forwarded to the board and was approved by a bipartisan majority with a 6-1 vote. I've worked on multiple budgets with the Board of Education, and I can honestly say that this was the most enlightening and transparent budget process that I've been a part of. Many good questions were asked of the central office team, and each and every one received a full and reasonable answer. This budget was carefully vetted, and each budget workshop was open and available for members of the public to attend or watch. The budget proposed by the board was both fiscally responsible and allowed the district to provide the resources that it needs to educate all of Stratford students. I'd like to thank the Finance Subcommittee for its diligence and for the historical knowledge that many of its members brought to the table. Thank you also to the stakeholders. Many of you are here tonight, staff, parents, and community members who have taken the time to be engaged in this budget process and who have been advocates for the Stratford Public Schools. And I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Sunday now.
Madam Chair, am I audible? Okay. So, a little bit kind of for the people in the back? Okay, I'll speak up. So I just would like to echo Ms. Cochran's statement, okay? It's been a long process. It's been a productive process where I think we've all learned quite a bit. For me personally, what I've been personally encouraged by is the fact that through this process, we've kept children, Stratford children, at the center of the conversation. So on May 11th, Town Council appropriated a Board of Education 2.5% increase over last year. And since that time, from staff, stakeholders, we received a few questions, and rather than send out a long letter, I figured we'd have a chance to turn this into a two-way dialogue and hear from you and also answer some of the questions you may have. Plus, or additionally, every time I send a letter, it gets leaked out to the media. So I'd rather talk with our people here, okay? So just to give you a quick overview of what we anticipate we will discuss today, right behind me on the screen, we'll talk a little bit about the budget process. We'll talk about the different scenarios. We'll talk about the impact of the work. But we also want to be able to talk about the central implications for what the 2.5, also in conjunction with the Alliance designation and the funds we may receive from those external entities, may mean for our district, our schools, but also our community. I want to take a quick moment to potentially also respond to some of the rhetoric and some of the narrative that has been prevailing. And then we're going to pivot, okay? We're going to close the book on the budget process. We have some internal work we need to do, but we're going to pivot our energy and concentrate on what's important. That's our kids and our staff. And then what I'm going to do to close is maybe list some of the things that I think we need to focus on as we piece together our alliance plans. Right? We're on the same page? Remember, this is a two-way dialogue, okay? So there'll be opportunities for us to pause. Maybe you can ask some clarifying questions. We also have Ms. Mangini, who's just a guru at this work, joining us today. She'll be able to answer detailed questions. Also in the audience, we have members of the district cabinet who will be able to answer questions that might be programmatic in nature, okay? All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide. And Ms. Mangini, perhaps come through the bullet points.
Good evening, everyone. And make sure this is close. I'm all about facts and figures. That's what I do. So I'm going to share a little bit with you to Ms. Corcoran's point about starting this budget process quite some time ago. The superintendent and I actually started it last October. We met with all schools and department heads, and as a result, ended up with a budget request of 5.77%. We really spent a lot of time understanding the request and working through it, and ultimately the superintendent presented a budget to the board that was a 4.6% increase over the current operating budget. The board, as Mrs. Cochran mentioned, really did a tremendous job in really reviewing line item by line item. They made a few tweaks and ultimately approved a budget with a 4.57% increase that was submitted to the town. I think it's important to note that that does reflect almost a $5.5 million increase, and that was the request. And I think it's important to note that of that 5.5 million, almost 5 million of it were major drivers that were contractual obligations, meaning salaries, benefits, transportation that we're required to provide, along with tuitions. Most, if not all, are mandated. So that brought us to a 4.1% need. Ultimately, the town did approve a 2.5%, giving us a little over $3 million increase, which we definitely appreciate, but doing the math, as you know, that leaves us with $2.5 million in reductions that we are now trying to determine how best to move forward. I do think it's worth just kind of mentioning that there has been a little bit of miscommunication out there. I believe that some of the statements made implied that the board was actually receiving a 4.9% increase, and that can be a little confusing. I believe that that was calculated based on some grant funds that definitely Alliance is coming our way, appears to be about $1.1 million. It's important, however, to understand that grant funds are very specific in their purpose and how we can use them. And that basically means that we cannot supplant. Fancy word for those of you who don't live in my world, supplanting basically simply means that we cannot use those funds to reduce or offset costs in our general operating budget that we have paid for through our general operating budget. The federal entitlement grants like Title I and IDEA really do require us very strict guidelines to supplement. Alliance also has the same and similar requirements. So I believe that the belief that there may be an increase in Title I, and normally we don't know what that is until November, and if we do receive that, it's great. We will definitely find wonderful things to do with it to enhance our programs for our students. But again, those dollars cannot be used to offset anything in our general operating budget. And lastly, I would just mention that it's important also to realize that the board has the final say on any reductions within their budget. And there were some comments shared simply as suggestions of where reductions could be taken, and I know that all of those will be explored. We definitely, thankfully, have some savings in our health insurance, so we are hoping at least $350,000 of the $2.5 million that we have to identify will come from health insurance simply as a further reduction in our renewal that we recently were made aware of. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of those areas. And Alliance, I had mentioned, and Dr. Sunday can certainly expound upon what we anticipate with Alliance. There's a lot involved. We've had a lot of meetings and we keep moving forward. And I will just mention, before MBR, I will mention the ESSER sunset. There is a fiscal cliff, a very serious one looming. If we had budgeted for every single salary that is currently expensed to ESSER, we would have needed an additional 1.87% in our budget. It's been questioned why the board decided last year to move those salaries to ESSER. And I think it's important to recognize that last year with a 2.25% increase from the town, when the board had requested 3.88, again, there's a delta there that we needed to bridge. The only way we could have done that was by eliminating positions. And the board understood very clearly that in the midst of the pandemic and all the additional needs that our students had, it was not the time to be eliminating positions, potentially increasing class sizes. The only alternative was the ESSER funds, and they were very prudent in ensuring that we had 3 years worth of those salaries approved by the state of Connecticut in that grant, giving us time, hopefully, to work with the town to bridge and prepare for that fiscal cliff and perhaps find other ways to repurpose some dollars within our budget. But for the budget development year 24-25, we will need that slightly over $2 million in additional funds to maintain staffing as is. So hopefully that provides some information. And Dr. Sunday, would you like to address the MBR?
Of course. Before we move forward, let's open up the floor for questions, because otherwise we'll just sit up here and throw a lot of data and a lot of information at the group. Yes?
What teacher salaries are being paid for out of the ESSER fund?
Currently, there are 3 elementary teachers that are being paid out of the ESSER funds.
And they're classroom teachers that are not special this or special that?
Correct.
Good question. So, yes?
What about your question is perception. There's perception that the Alliance Fund, the $1.1 million, that you clearly said is an ESSER plan. I'd like to clarify that, because in the example, that money cannot be used to pay for teacher salaries or utilities or things that we're currently using. Can you clarify that? Is that exactly what's going to happen?
Absolutely. Supplanting, actually, I printed out a document from the federal government. And supplanting basically is that federal funds cannot be used to pay for items or costs that are currently in a general operating budget. So it's important to recognize that if we're currently paying for X number of teachers, we can't take some of those teacher salaries and offset that cost to Alliance. We can't do it for utilities, we can't do it for supplies, we can't do it for anything that is currently in our general operating budget.
Yeah, I would probably also just extend on that. I don't know if we can clarify it any more than you clarified it. You hit it right on the head. And I think there's a spirit to that, because oftentimes, outside of maybe the federal grants do expire, right? So there has to be a plan to sustain the program or the structures in order to adequately deliver an educational service to our students. So they always hedge against doing that or engaging in that practice, and they check, right? So those are some really, really strong questions, some really, really good questions, and thank you, Ms. Mangini, for really that overview. I do want to say that when we started this process, the directive that I gave to the leadership team as we worked with the board was 2 directives, right? Before I arrived here, and when I arrived here, I heard this whole conversation about transparency, right? So I gave them 2 directives. Number 1, we will lead this budget process with transparency. And then 2, we're going to educate people about how the budget plays out in our day-to-day operation for 182 days, right? But more specifically, how this impacts kids and impacts the nature of the work that our staff do. So I would say we knocked that out of the park, okay? But we also are faced with some real realities. Number 1, we're still in the pandemic. We all know how the pandemic has impacted our student learning. We also know how the pandemic has impacted the nature of the work of our educators, who are exhausted and have been working incredibly hard. Exhausted. When I sit with my superintendent's advisory and I have an experienced and highly skilled educator who says, I've been doing this work for 25 plus years and this is the hardest year I've ever had, I have to pay attention. Insert the Alliance designation, where we have an external entity that's now telling us that we do have to improve, right? So now I'm going to our staff and I'm saying in front of 600 or so certified teachers and another 500 non-certified teachers that we have to improve, but by the way, we have limited resources for you to do the work, right? So our work as district leaders and our work as board members is to always advocate to make sure that we center Stratford children in the best possible place to find some level of success. And we need to do that because the decisions we make now will not just play out for the 22-23 academic year. There's a precipitous implication of how this plays out over the next 5, 10 years. But beyond that, one of the other pieces that makes this work even more complex is as we are now required to go through reductions, and we're going through that process. We're on the back end of things, and over the next couple of days, I'll present our recommendations to the board. But the other challenge of this for me is, as I spent time with our staff, recognize that about 50% of my staff are taxpayers right here in town. So we have a lot of work in front of us. But perhaps what I can do is maybe talk a little bit more about the district implications, okay? So for those of you who may have a good understanding of Stratford, as a school district, we're one of the biggest school districts in the state of Connecticut. There is approximately 170 communities, and Stratford is somewhere in the top 18, maybe even top 15, right? We have 13 schools, one adult education program, which makes our academic organization a very complex system, right? So when we make one decision here, there is a precipitous and a domino effect all the way from the conversations that happen behind the bench at the Board of Education chambers to that second grader who's sitting in the classroom at Chapel or Franklin or Lordship, right? And we have to be able to keep that at the front of our conversations, in the front of our minds. So that's why it's important that we continue to invest in our schools. Because oftentimes they say that, healthy schools are reflective of healthy communities. Now, it's my honest opinion that when the Alliance designation came out, and after having spent about 7 or 8 months here in Stratford, I don't think that that Alliance designation adequately or accurately reflects who we are as an academic institution. I'll say that bar none. And I'll say that bar none because I have the credibility to back it up. In my previous districts, we were Alliance districts. So I'm familiar with the work. And the things that we are doing here, the numbers are the numbers. If the state tells us X, Y, and Z, it's what it is. We're going to step up to the plate and we're going to do the work that we need to do for our kids, because that's who we are, and that's who we're going to continue to be. But I do believe with the right infrastructure that we have some opportunities to turn this around quickly. I'll say that very openly. To the town's defense, they are 100% right. The way the Alliance District resource allocation works is it's a carve out of the ECS. It's a carve out of the ECS, which now leaves a revenue hole for the town. So a lot of towns complain about this, and rightfully so, okay, because it's an unforeseen expense that now has to be accounted for. This year there was some legislation done, okay, and I can share very publicly that against the traditional Alliance District program, I've spent countless hours on the phone or video calls with the State Department of Education officials. With the look back years, that's how it's calculated. Historically, it's been done against the fiscal year 2012. With the 3 new districts that now enter the Alliance program, the look back year is 1 year. So the traditional Alliance ECS funds that will come to the districts, i.e. us, against the look back year of 2012, we would have been appropriated about $4.6 million, which positions us to do some pretty comprehensive things, right, in order to innovate and make sure we continue to position our kids for improvements. I heard at one point that as recently or as far back as the late 90s, 99, early 2000s, Stratford was on a watch list. I can't turn back the hands of time, but I've tasked them, all of them, including myself, to improve our district. The status quo is not good for me personally, and it's certainly not good for Stratford kids or our staff. That would not be the standard. Are you all familiar with what the Alliance District designation means? Can anybody, I'm going to treat this like a classroom. I want to hear your voices, right? Can anybody tell me which population of schools are designated as Alliance districts? Yes.
The lowest 33 school districts were in accountability in the state. However, it's only local and regional school districts, and it has to have at least 1,000.
You are a researcher and a scholar. So let's contextualize that, right? So if I share with you there's about 170 communities in the state of Connecticut, just visually, Stratford is not in the bottom 36, right? And our school should not reflect that. Yes, I see you go.
Were we, I thought we were looking at 2017, 18, and 19 and not the COVID years, where we weren't even, in our district at that point. So, my question is, like, something wasn't working in those years. So, and you coming in on July 1st of last year, why wasn't there some sort of a strategy at that point when we already knew that we didn't need anybody to give us a score to
Yeah.
know that we were not doing well right now? And why wasn't a strategy revised and a plan put in place at that point or soon after you arrived to make changes? We're in a whole other year.
Yeah, yeah. So,
I have no problem with that.
yeah,
I
no,
don't want to be thrown. I have kids that go to magnet school outside, the Bridgeport. Warrenburg's than any of our schools do. And, I don't see how throwing more money at something where there's no new strategy, or I have not seen any plan to say, oh, this program's not working, let's get rid of this, we'll use some alliance funds, maybe do something different. And if it works, then we can put that in our budget going forward, and then maybe the town will give you more than 2.5. I have no problem with that. But to throw more money after something that's not to do the same thing that we've been doing,
yeah.
makes no sense to me.
So you hit it on the head, and there's some easy ways to answer that question. Okay, I think you're naming the obvious here, and I think your sentiments is something that I would back up as well. Okay, I had breakfast with Chris Pia. Okay, we had open, honest, vulnerable conversations. It was the same conversation. Whatever we were doing did not have the impact that we hoped it would have. So why was it not, exacting and something new, creative, constructive? So there's a couple ways to answer that question. So yes, number one, it's the alliance designation is based on pre-pandemic data, right? So 3 years of decline in data. But something happened between the third year of decline in data and today, right? What's that thing? COVID, right? Pandemic completely jolted the entire world, right? Insert Dr. O'Sunday, right? Board appointed me in March of last year. And, full disclosure, so I was going through my interview process and I was researching and studying in the town of Stratford and our schools, right? I recognized that we were not far from that designation. I did recognize that, right? I did not think that the alliance designation was going to come to us in February. Nobody did, because of the pandemic, right? And that was one of the first questions Dr. Gator and I asked when we were on that call with the State Department of Education. So your question is, when the school year started, why did we not start a plan, something different, okay? So there's a couple ways to respond to that question. So number one, a lot of our energy was hyper-focused on kids and staff, right? We were not out of the pandemic, okay? It's making sure that people can get to work safely, remain as safe as possible. We had to deal with the mask situation, we had to deal with the positivity rates, all those different things. The second way for me to respond to that is I began to have those conversations. I started July 1st. So our administrators will tell you we've had deep conversations about overall school improvement and overall whole systems improvement. But one of the worst things that any executive can do is come in and completely dismantle things and say, here's a new plan without fully understanding and studying things. Specifically in the pandemic, right? Specifically with an organization, an academic organization this big, right? Because if an error is made, it will have an impact on kids and staff in any typical year, let alone in the pandemic, right? So it's not prudent. You're not going to find too many superintendents who come in, unless they're in a strict turnaround environment, who come in and completely rattle things to the ground. Plus, I would have got ran out of here in the first 2-3 months, right? So it's about being prudent in that, right? And then the other piece now is, as we continue to come up with our plans about how we want to improve our district, it was important to me, okay, and it's important for anybody who sits in my chair, to be able to identify and determine the spaces that we needed to improve, but also determine and identify the spaces that we do some things well, right? There's a lot of assets, and I will tell you this, if I did not feel strongly about the potential of Stratford, I wouldn't be here, okay? And I wouldn't demand so much from so many different people, right? So that being said, we did not forget that we have to start to look ahead. Even in the context of trying to manage the positivity rates and COVID and exhaustion and staffing shortages and all those different things that make a complex organization like this, let alone some of the student behaviors in the fall, right? So we started having those conversations. And as we continue to construct our budget, right, it has to be aligned to district priorities and board goals. The problem now is this, is a lot of people are asking questions, what's your plan, what's your plan, what's your plan? I've got a plan. I'm trained to do this work, right? But if I don't co-construct the plan with our outstanding educators, our teachers, if I don't spend time hearing the voices of our teachers about what, from their expertise, they feel and their knowledge of our kids, I've only been in the district at that point in time about 7 months, about what they feel is most important for kids, and co-construct it with our families and community partners and business partners about what are the essential variables and attributes that every child who comes to a Stratford school needs to have and know and be able to do. If 3 years from now I leave Stratford, my plan goes with me. So that's why in this work we always talk about making sure we co-construct things, right? And I'll tell you this, we're in the process of it right now. For the last 3 Wednesdays, for 3 hours at a clip, I have a cross-section of administrators, community partners. I have 5 parents who are involved. I have teachers who are involved from every developmental level. And we're completely analyzing and having vulnerable and difficult conversations about the things that we need to do to improve. I'm fortunate that we don't have to have a long, comprehensive process, right? Because the foundation that we're building on is the portrait of the graduate work that this community took on a few years back, right? Otherwise, it would be a 6-month process. So to your point about why wasn't there a plan put in place, I can't answer that because the existing plan we knew was scheduled to sunset this year. So the conversation, in theory, should have been done last year, even before my arrival. But I think there's some level of prudency that's attached to it that when a new leader comes in, we want to hear his thoughts and we would like for him to guide that process. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. So as we go through this strategic planning process, whatever we design as a group, my plan is to get this done over the next couple of weeks. So before our staff break, right, for the summer, for a much-deserved summer break, I can give a broad overview of some of the district and the board priorities, and then some of the things that we're looking to do through the Alliance plan, right, which we are doing right now. We have a team feverishly working to construct that plan because we have to submit that at some point this summer.
So it's the budget that didn't get approved, the one that you guys wanted, did that include any of your new plans? And did it exclude some of the plans that maybe were not working?
Yeah, so when I presented my budget in February 28th, I believe was the date, right? The 28th? My board members. Yep, February 28th. We presented, okay, I studied our budget appropriations for the last 10 years, and I knew exactly what we've been appropriated on average, right? I've studied, when we've had increases, I've studied when we've been level, so on and so forth. So, as I shared with you earlier, what we did is we led with transparency, and we spoke about need. And I presented a budget to the board, which, in our opinion, in my opinion, was a bare bones budget. A budget that was centered on, to the extent possible, making sure we maintain the most essential component of student learning, which is teachers, right? So we presented a budget, and I can share with you, okay, because you're asking me a very deliberate question, which I think is the right question to ask. I can share with you all the things that my administrators wanted to include in their requests, knowing that, to Ms. Mangini's point, if we put all those things in there, we would have been closer to 6%. I had to turn around and tell our administrators, after I challenged them in the summer to construct strong SIPs, school improvement plans, I had to tell them, I can't give you this because I don't think it will get approved or adopted. I presented a bare bones budget, As we went through the process, struck out a whole bunch of things from the academic department, a whole bunch of resources from the performing arts, a whole bunch of resources. We did some things from a technology standpoint, and we were still sitting at a 4.6. A 4.6 that was driven by 4 or 5 large buckets. Salaries and benefits, right? Transportation, we got to get our kids to school, right? And then special education costs, which has just been on a steady increase. That was it. Presented to the board, every board member come through that entire book. We have 4 or 5 workshops, asked deliberate questions, it was open to the public, we got everything posted. The board made some recommendations, trimmed it down to a 4.5. We felt rock solid as a board. It was a 6-1 vote, right? We felt solid about that, and we returned it to the town, and we waited, right? So, to your point, the things for improvement and potentially removing some of the things that were not effective in the past, they were proposed by our administrators and our teachers, but we couldn't give it to them because the gap of what we would have submitted would not have been realistic, particularly against the last 10 years of appropriations.
What did the town council give as their reason? What were they saying it didn't need?
That's part of this conversation. That's part of this conversation. And I think that's why we're having this conversation, right? So, the other piece now is this, we do have to pivot away from a narrative about people telling us what we do need and what we don't need, right? I think it's one of those things where the people who need to tell me as a superintendent what we need are the experts who stand in front of kids every day, are the people who are credentialed as educators to say, okay, Dr. Osende, if you want us to improve, these are the things that you need to furnish us with, right? And then within reason, we construct a budget and we say to the town, these are the things that we need for improvement, right? People who are not in classrooms, people who have not taught kids or written lesson plans, cannot tell us, I'm not gonna go to a house builder and tell him he doesn't need a boiler, right? I'm not gonna go to a doctor and tell him he doesn't need surgical tools, right? I'm not saying that to be flippant, but we have experts who do the work every day. And it's our job, and this is Leadership 101, is position your people with the right resources to do the best work. That's an ethos of it. I shared with the board a few weeks back this notion of reciprocal accountability, right? I can expect more from my staff than I'm willing to support. It defies logic, right? So, in a way, as a way to compensate to some of the fiscal challenges, what I have done with my team is I have studied our academic organization. And the strategy that we've employed is really some organizational redesign and some organizational re-engineering. We have some opportunities to find some efficiencies, which might end up resulting in cost savings, but there's a lot of work to do. And I really enjoy your conversation because I think you're asking all the right questions, but I think we're in process right now, right? We're in process. And I think over the next couple of weeks, we're gonna have a finished product. But how that plays out is the work that we have to continue to do.
That's what we're gonna do, because you didn't kind of explain what the council said. You're only at 2.5, you're not getting 4.7, whatever the number was. What was their explanation? They must have gone through the numbers too. What were they thinking we didn't need?
I don't know if it's, and I would invite my other colleagues to chime in on this. I don't know if it was a function of them telling us what we did not need. I think there is this mental model that also exists around supplanting, right? That's number one. And number two, the justification is that, and it makes sense, it makes logical sense. They have a tax base that represents the entire community. And a fraction of that tax base don't have kids in our schools. So I understand the logic. You're giving me the council standpoint, but I'm also telling you that the council has a job to do, but I also have a job to do, and so does the board. And my job is centrally focused on our teachers, our students, their success. And if we do the things that I think we can do over time, this entire community will benefit from that. Strong schools are often clear indicators of strong communities. If we don't do the things that we can do, there's a chance, I've seen this happen across the state, and I've seen this happen across the country. When you do the this research, we study school districts that devolve, right? They go backwards. And it essentially turns the community, puts them in some level of purgatory, right? If we do the things that I think we can do, I think we can come out of this quickly, right? But the one thing that is evident is that it's going to take the entire community. It will take the entire community. And I was having this conversation yesterday at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast, and we have people who are willing to support the schools. We have people who are willing to position themselves, whether it's through scholarship or foundations or whatever it is, or just exposing kids to careers by having them come and work for them, or coming into a classroom and talking about a specific career. We have people in the Stratford community who want to be a part of the solution. So I am walking away from this feeling very encouraged, despite the conditions. But there's some real implications for the work that we have in front of us. I'm going to take one more question before I go to the next slide.
It's not a question, but Dr. Asante, can you just touch upon the MBR on the previous slide and the implications of that?
Yeah, the exemption, I would say, caught a lot of us by surprise. The exemption, we happen to be the only community in the state of Connecticut that received that exemption, right? The town did appropriate 2.5, but there's a broader speculative context to that I think I would rather pause on responding for that, okay? But I would say enveloped in that legislation is really its impact on ACS costs that comes to us. And there were 3 communities, ourselves, Enfield and Plainfield, that were impacted. And I, as frustrated as I might be, because I think there's some resources that our initial appropriation from the state was sliced by about 76%, from 4.6 to 1.1. And, but as I look at other communities, like those 2 communities I just mentioned, they got their Alliance designation, and they're receiving next to no funds just because of the look back here, right? So it's like you get the designation, you have to go tell your staff that we have to improve, but there's limited resources to be able to innovate and do the work, right? So we have a host of things that are in front of us. And for me personally, I'm encouraged by the people I have on my team, the people I stand side by side with to do this work. When I say that, I'm talking about the entire professional community. I'm talking about all of our teachers, all of our non-certified staff, all of our school leaders, all of our district leaders, and the board. Okay? I want to take a moment to potentially respond to something. Okay? You just had a quick overview of the numbers specific to the budget. Okay? But I am going to speak about this because this has sat on my mind. Okay? I'm the superintendent of schools. But I'm going to speak now as a professional. I'm going to speak now as somebody who pours all of my energy into this work. Okay? On May 9th, the town council had an ordinance committee meeting with the public forum. And 2 specific individuals went up and spoke. And I have to say I've never seen anything in that type of fashion that I saw on that day. I've been blessed and privileged to be an educator in Connecticut for a long time. I've done good work a lot of places. This is my 5th community I've been blessed to be a part of as an educator. My 5th. And I had 2 people go up and speak about me. Now, everybody's entitled to an opinion, right? Everybody's entitled to an opinion. I will listen to your opinion all day. But if you stand in front of the public, and you try to, it's PR, if anybody has a PR degree, you know exactly what it is. It's trying to manage the narrative, it's trying to spin stories. If you're going to have an opinion, you're entitled to that. What you're not entitled to is lying through that opinion. It was disrespectful as a professional. It was deplorable, and I can speak with a high level of confidence that I know that it does not represent the Stratford community. Or when I have people from other states sending me text messages and asking me how I'm doing because they saw it, that's a concern. That's not who we are. But I want to take a quick moment, okay, to really kind of address some things, because part of that PR narrative is people out there trying to spin certain things. And I paid close attention, right? And I heard phrases like fear-mongering, intimidating, and all those different things. And for those of you who've been around for a long time, let's call it what it is. That's a tired narrative that in some spaces is oftentimes associated with a black man, and there's no space for that. Like, take that stuff and please take it somewhere else. At no point in my communication to 1,050 hardworking professionals in Stratford Public Schools did I ever make any threats. For as long as I've been here, I've heard the story about transparency and communication. Communication has not been good. Communication has not been good. I didn't have to threaten anybody. The people I work side by side with are incredibly smart. If they weren't smart, they shouldn't work with our kids. But when you see a 4.57, you see a 2.5, it's simple computational math. So it's not a threat. And when I sent my communication out, I sent my communication out because our leaders, our teachers, asked me for an update. I had a conversation with our leaders earlier that day, and I told them I was going to send that communication out. I'm very deliberate about what I write. It was from this statement that those individuals said I was intimidating and invoking fear into people. I've been very clear about this work since the start, since February. We want to protect our teachers because by research and by just simple conventional wisdom, they impact student learning more effectively than any other aspect of the work. And with this, it's creating a narrative. But beyond that, it's the lies that came with that. If you want to stand up there, talk with facts. At one point, I think I heard somebody reference 1.5 billion in the staff reserve line. Or somebody also mentioned that we don't have a staffing shortage. If that's the case, then Stratford is doing something dramatically different than the rest of the country, right? You can talk to any one of our teachers who has to cover, someone else's prep, or any one of our administrators who has a hard time trying to find subs. We're not unique in that sense. Across Connecticut, there's staffing shortages. We have a lot of work to do. So this is not about fear. This is about the realities of what we need to do to make sure we have a good chance at a successful year, because come September 1st, we're going to have almost 7,000 kids come back to school. So I'm going to close the page on that. Okay, I'm done and I'm tired of that rhetoric. If you want to have that conversation, take it to a parking lot somewhere. We're not doing that at Stratford Public Schools. Plain and simple. So, real quick, we have to keep this moving. I want to pivot to something that I think is important, okay? And that is this conversation about our student performance, okay? Our kids have been working hard, and these are some of the innovative things that I think we have the opportunity to do, okay? Last fall, we presented our PSAT data, and as to be expected, it wasn't pretty, okay? A lot of disruption with the pandemic, so on and so forth. However, I did task our team to innovate and try something different, right? We created an SAT prep program. Harold Grice, Sue Schmidt, and a few of our coordinators pieced it together, worked with Principal Del Piano and Dr. Graff at Bunnell, and we had students attend. There is some stark data behind us, and this is really, what's behind me is really where the board needs to focus their energy. It's really where us as educators need to continue to have conversations for obvious reasons. We'll give a broader presentation at a board meeting at a later time in the year, but you can see the stark difference for our kids who had access to a program, right? I don't want to continue to hear our alumni come back and say, I was in the classroom and I felt like a fish out of water, I wasn't prepared. Because they go to a school in the southeast or somewhere not up here in New England. For selfish reasons, but I would say obvious reasons, we have a responsibility to make sure that when our kids leave the parameters of our community, they have the best chance to be selected for whatever they choose to do. Whether it's college, military, career, what have you. I don't care about kids from Michigan. I care about Stratford kids. Because guess what? After they do the 4 years in school or wherever they go, by the time they're 28, 29, they come back here. And they get married right here in town. And they start their families right here in town. And then their kids end up in elementary schools. So we do want them to be successful. Because when they come back here, they need to be successful citizens within Stratford. I'm going to go to the next slide. I think it's up, okay? I can share with you that we are working concurrently right now with a couple of different things. So the POG work has been ongoing for the last couple of years, okay? And the SOP work, which is our strategic planning team, again, as I mentioned, is a cross-section of our educators, community partners, and a handful of our parents. We're doing those things right now concurrently. But as we look at the alliance designation and with the plan that we have to submit, I have worked, and I'm working with Dr. Gator and her team and a fleet of coordinators. We're having deep conversations. They come in early in the morning before school starts, and I've given them really 5 buckets of things that I would like to see us focus on. And these things are backed by research, right? We also know that, so with bullet point number 1, early elementary literacy and numeracy. If kids are not reading effectively by grade 3, there's a precipitous impact as they continue to grow and develop into the middle school, right? At the middle school level, SRBI across the entire system, but with a concentrated focus on what we're doing at the middle school level, okay, for obvious reasons. That's the tier 2 and tier 3 work. I do want to expand SAT and AP, right? We're seeing some of the data as you saw in the previous slide. We want to give that opportunity to our kids. Uniquely enough, it's our 16-year-olds, it's our juniors, right? So they're in that developmental age where they're coming of age, where they're getting a license, they're playing sports, they have a job, right? So they have to deal with that internal conflict of, can I squeeze something else in there? But it's prudent for us to have to make this available to them, right? Because we're seeing the obvious results. School safety and climate are critical, right? School safety and climate are critical. I'm not going to stand in front of you as a superintendent. I don't think any of our leaders will stand in front of you, any of our teachers in front of you, and say that I can guarantee you there are never going to be fights. What I would say we need to continue to work on is we need to reduce the frequency of fights, right? When you were in school, when I was in school, there were fights. There were kids smoking in the bathroom, all those different things, right? Generations have changed. And we also know now, because of the isolation of the last couple of years, right, people are probably more quick to respond physically than going through the emotional regulations. So school safety is important. And if we're going to place the expectation on ourselves as educators, we need to find a way to create some level of balance and equilibrium to what the school day looks like so our educators can do the best work. And then the last piece is instructional leadership, okay? As I said previously, the work of us as leaders is to make sure we work with our colleagues to put them in the best position to do their best work, right? But conversely, as we talk about instructional leadership, we have instructional leaders who oversee schools. But if our instructional leaders are chasing kids around all day, managing behavioral issues, or in PPTs or on phones with our families, they don't get a chance to do their best work to support teachers in the classroom. They don't get a chance to build and construct the best professional learning opportunities, right? So we need to figure out how that dynamic plays out. We'll have more conversations about this. So you'll see constructs, and we're going through the beta, what I call the beta phase of this right now, as we continue to refine these plans. But these plans, right, these big buckets are also tethered to different components of the accountability index. Does that make sense? The Alliance District Accountability Index, right? So we have some opportunities to gain some points in specific places. We have some opportunities to see some improvements in terms of how it plays out with our student performances. We have some opportunities to do some things to hopefully decrease some of the information that happens in schools, not just here in Stratford, but across the country. So with that, I'd like to close with this, right? Which is our North Star. If our kiddos acquire those competencies, we feel as a community that they have a better chance than most places to find success in whatever they choose to do. I will adjourn with my little soapbox moment, and if there's any other questions, I would be happy to take them, and any one of my colleagues would be open to responses. There's no bad kids in Stratford. We have kids make bad decisions.
I'm just using this as an example.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Yep.
What is happening. But what I'm saying is that if there are like kids who are constantly doing the wrong things, constantly are not in an environment that allows them to transpire to be something good, or because TV is not going to cut it. It's your neighborhood, it's your schools, it's your teachers, it's the people that you surround yourself with that will transpire for you to be something better. And the only thing, and I can attest to this because my dad's a pastor. So our church is in Bridgeport. So he has made it, and we're Haitian. So he has made it a standpoint to make sure the people in his congregation does not get pregnant, that they all go to school, and they all get good grades. To the point where he says if you're in college, you get a 4.0, the church will donate $1,000 to you. I think that's the same thing that kind of needs to happen here in Stratford. We need to remix everything up, not just can't just be all like really well, average people who have good amount of money who can handle who are in this school, and then the other population down in another section where like they're struggling, and that's when fights start because they're like, they're all struggling somewhere, and when you're around people who are constantly struggling, what are you gonna do? Fight, because it's like this is mine, instead of seeing like what the possibilities can be for them.
So I'll share with you this, and we'll take perhaps 2 or 3 more questions, and we'll wrap it up. So that conversation is happening, okay? And over the last year, I've heard a lot about the last redistricting piece. It is happening, but it's my position, right, that we have to be deliberate about studying it deeper and designing things in a way that 2 or 3 years from now, we're not having the same conversation. So it is happening. I think at some point, it may be a reality, but I don't think we're going to be ready to do that for the start of school this coming year, right? Yes.
I know a lot, everyone's saying that they don't want to affect staffing. However, I was laid off last year, and then retired, but it's really hard to see that big gap and not wonder if I'm going to have a position next year.
Yeah, no, so you hit it on the head, and that was our fear, right? And that's why we led with transparency. You know, our big piece, so, you know, as a psychologist, right, we always say that, you know, the best way to respond to fear or anxiety is to put information in people's hands, right? Is to at least let them know, even if you can't say that, we have a solution, right? So that's why communication is so important. I can share with you what we've been doing. Okay, so over the last, since the 11th, since the town gave us the appropriation, we knew exactly what that number was. And to be honest with you, that was probably liberating in a sense, because now we knew exactly what we had to work with. We've gone through a couple of different scenarios, and we're still putting fine details on a couple of things. We had a 2.5-hour session today. We're going to continue to put the details on things. I will not release it to the public until I revisit that with the board, okay? But the other piece now is, in between that time, the people who may potentially show up in those scenarios, right, that will be proposed to the board, we want to extend the professional courtesy to be able to sit down and have a conversation with them first, right? So the first time they're seeing it or hearing about it is not in the publication that comes out, right? That's just, it's part of my work since I've been here, even with the first iteration. I've always led with that. We're going to sit down as a professional courtesy to have a conversation, to have a conversation with the people who might be impacted before it goes public. So we're thinking that early next week, we'll be able to have something that can fall in the laps of people.
Just briefly, I would like to just reiterate the fact that personnel is usually the last place we look, but unfortunately, Board of Education budgets are normally at least 75% staff and benefits. Coupled with all the other contractual and mandated obligations, we probably just have about 5% true discretionary accounts. So unfortunately, when you're looking to reduce by $2.5 million, $3 million, you really don't have any alternatives but to look at staffing. And we really have tried to work through scenarios that will be as least impactful to our classrooms as possible. And it's a challenge. And to Dr. Asunde's point, we've really spent a lot of time and a lot of thoughtful deliberation on what will hopefully soon ultimately be the final plan.
We'll communicate more in the coming days. We're doing a lot of internal work, and you know, at the end of the day, people will be impacted, but we also feel that the design we're piecing together to discuss with the board will allow us to open up the school year with effective possibilities. Okay, I'm gonna adjourn. Okay, I have to boogie to a different event. Plus, I was told that if I sat at Stratford High with a banal outfit for too long, I may catch on fire, right? But thank you so much for this conversation. That's really what it was. Thank you so much for investing your time and your commitment to kids.